Hello and welcome to this presentation on the COVID crisis and the future of the German automotive production model. Welcome from myself, Martin Szybdziński, and my colleague Grzegorz Lechowski. We are both affiliated to the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. During the next 15 minutes, we will discuss the impact of the COVID crisis on the German automotive industry. Our presentation is based on a new project which we started recently and in which we analyze the long-term implications of the crisis for the automotive sector in a comparative perspective. Our project is based on the analysis of secondary sources, press releases, company materials, and on interviews with key stakeholders, company representatives, representatives of automotive associations, trade unions, and state representatives. We started already with first interviews, but we are only in the middle of our interview program. For this reason, what we present today are the first preliminary insights and hypotheses. We will focus on three main points. The impact of the COVID crisis on the automotive industry in Germany. Second, the recent government interventions during the crisis. And third, the responses of trade unions to the crisis and to the government's stimulus packages. When we analyze the impact of the COVID crisis, we have to distinguish two dimensions. First, they are the direct disruptions directly caused by the pandemic. These direct disruptions included, first, the breakdown of the demand for cars during 2020, resulting from the fact that the dealerships closed during national lockdowns, and that many buyers have simply postponed decisions to buy a new car due to economic uncertainty. Resulting from this, the EU market for passenger cars contracted quite dramatically in 2020, with the number of registrations down by around 23% in comparison to 2019. Second, we have the supply-side disruptions within global value chains, which have revealed some important bottlenecks within the transnational automotive production system. When today we look back at these direct disruptions, we see, however, that they had limited character. The automotive demand started to pick up quickly, and today the automotive market is growing, even though it did not yet reach its pre-crisis levels. The supply chain disruptions ended quickly, with the exception of automotive semiconductors. It seems as if the automotive firms' problems to buy semiconductors would continue for some time. While this story is still developing, we may indeed expect some kind of reshoring processes to take place in this supply chain. This would mean to try to locate certain amount of semiconductor production in Europe. But a general push towards more reshoring or nearshoring of automotive supply chains did not take place. But all these direct impacts of the COVID crisis are only one dimension. We argue that there is a second dimension, namely the indirect impacts of the crisis. These indirect impacts stem from the fact that the COVID crisis coincides with three major transformations of the automotive industry. The transition from the combustion engine to electric mobility due to the need for clean transportation. Second, the transformation of production systems and business models due to digitalization. And third, the shifting division of labor within the global value chains of the automotive industry, and in particular, the continuing relocation of production to low-wage countries. I will have a brief look at these three transformations before we turn to the responses to the crisis. Regarding the transition to electric mobility, we have to remember that the German automotive industry for a long time neglected the investments in these technologies and hoped that the diesel technology would allow it to reach their required reductions in CO2 emissions, while at the same time sticking to the combustion engine technology. This approach collapsed with the diesel crisis. Since then, German automotive companies ramped up investments in electric vehicles. Some of them do it as a radical shift to new technologies, like Volkswagen. Others are slower, like Daimler or BMW. But the ever stricter European CO2 emission regulations and the imminent penalties for car producers are pushing the industry toward the production of more carbon-neutral vehicles, and first of all, of battery electric vehicles. This transformation is a major challenge. There's a number of studies about potential employment impacts of this transformation. While several of them come to the conclusion that the net effects of unemployment might be even positive, if the newly created jobs in the production, infrastructure, and maintenance in the field of electric mobility compensate for the job losses in traditional combustion engine technologies. But the newly created jobs will probably only partially be filled with workers working today in combustion engine factories. What we will see over the coming decade in Germany will be the loss of several 10,000 jobs in engine and engine component production. When you look at the second important trend, the digitalization, the predictions are vague. But once again, we have promises of net employment growth to digitalization, but also of job cuts in the field of low-skilled production and logistics jobs. Whatever the job impact of this transformation will be, investments in digitalization or Industry 4.0 are regarded as a core element for the German automotive industry to retain competitiveness, not only with regard to other established automotive companies, but also with regard to new challengers from other industries. This means investing in the mastering of the cloud technologies and building own industrial cloud infrastructures, as can be seen in the German flagship project Catena X and Volkswagen efforts to ramp up its own industrial cloud. This means investing in new competences in the field of big data analytics and artificial intelligence, not only, but also regarding the autonomous driving technology. And this means exploring new internet-based business models. The third relevant trend, which I mentioned, the relocation of production, the transformation of global value chains, finally. When we look at this trend, there seems to be an acceleration of trends which we observed over the last decade. During the last 20 years, it was characteristic for the German automotive industry that on the one hand, it massively invested in production sites in Central Eastern Europe, but on the other, it massively invested in production sites in Central Eastern Europe. And low-cost component production remained and became an important pillar of the German automotive industry's success. But on the other hand, it succeeded in keeping production jobs in Germany. Putting it simply, this was based on a product strategy focusing on premium vehicles and on a form of production organization which kept lead plants in Germany. These lead plants were responsible for production ramp-ups, for cooperation with product development, for the implementation of new production technologies. And of course, we also saw the diffusion of lead plant roles to other countries, including low-cost locations in Central Eastern Europe. But it was a gradual process, and German plants retained their advantages. And what we observe now during the COVID pandemic is a change. I think we see how all three trends, shift to electric mobility, digitalization, and relocation overlap. And what we observe is a massive announcement of job cuts, plant closures, and the relocation projects from Germany to low-wage countries. As this figure here illustrates, the announced job cuts in Germany are quite unique in the German context. We see here that the announced job cuts add up to around 50,000 jobs in Germany, which is much more than in any other European country. Even though we have also to admit that France, with announced job cuts of around 13 to 14,000 persons, is similarly hit if we consider the different sizes of the automotive industry in both countries, Germany and France. So to sum up our argumentation so far, the impact of the COVID crisis for the German automotive industry does not only stem from its direct and limited consequences for car demand and the supply of parts, it rather stems from the overlapping of several structural transformation processes, which are now accelerated due to the pandemic. Several automotive companies use the crisis as a window of opportunity for more radical steps in restructuring their production and also R&D footprint. And as my colleague Grzegorz will explain, the regulators also decided to use the crisis for accelerating efforts for transformation. And now I give over to Grzegorz.
Thank you, Martin. I will now continue focusing on the policy responses to the COVID crisis in the German automotive industry. In general, as Martin has just indicated, the interventions of the German government, which take the form of various state aid programs targeted at the automotive sector, focus not simply on supporting the automotive firms in surviving the crisis, but rather on helping the industry manage the transition to low carbon technologies. And the first thing which is important to observe in this context are the specific regulatory and institutional conditions within which the German government develops the stimulus package. For one thing, there is the context of the EU level regulations. And here we can mention first the fact that the European Commission decided to tie its own huge COVID stimulus package to the goals of the European Green Deal, that is to the plan to achieve carbon neutrality of the entire EU economy by 2050. And if the German government will decide to use the EU money to support the automotive industry, these funds will have to be used for projects compatible with these decarbonization goals. Second, and perhaps more importantly in the German context, given the Germany's relatively low benefits from the EU stimulus package as compared to the national GDP, the German state aid for the automotive industry is developed in the context of the increasingly strict EU emission standards and in the context of the threat of huge penalties for the automotive industry, for the automotive firms who will not meet these standards. At the beginning of the COVID crisis, there were even hopes in the German industry and politics that the EU may decide to relax its decarbonization policies in order to help the automotive industry manage the economic downturn. But in fact, the opposite has happened, and the EU may even try to further tighten the existing regulations soon. Another important context within which the German government has been developing its policy response to the COVID crisis in the automotive industry is the traditionally close corporatist coordination at the country level between the government, the industry, and trade union representatives. Interestingly, before the COVID crisis, the specific national institutional framework has not really helped to accelerate the technological change in the automotive sector. But during the COVID crisis, the negotiations between the government and the industry and trade unions have indeed already led to a number of relatively progressive proposals. And I think a few factors can explain this change. First of all, the fact that the regulatory pressures from the EU are indeed increasing. Second, the fact that industry may be now motivated by the financial support provided by the government. And finally, the fact that the government itself will now be motivated to minimize the negative employment effects of the already ongoing sectoral transformation, which is what Martin was talking about in his part of the presentation. And in this complex political economic situation, the German government has already introduced a number of targeted support programs for the automotive industry. All these programs belong to the broader German COVID recovery plan. And one of the programs which I am now showing on the table, the program 35B, is a demand stimulating program which doubles the existing buyer incentives for electric vehicles to the level of 6,000 euros for EVs cheaper than 40,000 euros and to the level of 5,000 euros for more expensive cars. Importantly, this buyer incentive program was very controversial in Germany. In the early months of the COVID crisis, both the automotive industry and some prominent politicians from the ruling coalition requested that the government provides incentives also for combustion vehicles. And at the same time, a strong critique of the plans to introduce the buyer incentive program came from various environmental organizations, which criticized the idea that also hybrid vehicles will be included in the program. That is, vehicles which in fact have very often very limited electrical ranges. The two other support programs that I am now showing on the screen focus not on the demand side, but rather on technological innovation and infrastructure development. And so the program 35C provides funding for firms who want to upgrade their technological capabilities and develop new product portfolios. The program focuses in the first place on the supplier sector and SMEs. And while the program is still developing, one general thing that we can say about it is that the program attempts to make very precise interventions in the areas which are critical for the international competitiveness of German automotive locations. Funding will be provided, for instance, to support regional clusters of suppliers on which then German OEMs operating in the country will be able to rely. Second, the project will support also innovation in powertrain technologies, but this in a technology open way, including also hydrogen and hybrid technologies, which is very much in line with the expectations of the German supplier sector. And finally, supported within this program will be also digitalization efforts by firms focusing on both product and process innovations. And important here is that the program will rely on various already existing industrial policy initiatives coordinated by the German government, such as the Industry 4.0 discourse and more recently the Gaia-X Industrial Cloud project. The last selected program which I am showing in the table, the program 35F, focuses on charging infrastructure and on innovation in electric vehicle and battery technologies. And one interesting thing that we can say about this project is that the importance of public funding for charging infrastructure has been strongly emphasized by the German automotive industry, and first of all by the VDA Association during the recent negotiations with the government. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense because German firms have been falling behind some global competitors, first of all, maybe Tesla, in developing their own charging stations in Europe. And now, in the last part of our presentation, let me briefly return to the question of the close coordination between the government and other sectoral actors in the context of the COVID crisis. More specifically, I will focus on the observation that German trade unions, and I mean here, first of all, the IG Metall, are now actively involved in managing the technological change in the automotive sector. The first thing to observe here is that for IG Metall, the decision to start pushing for a faster technological transformation must have been a difficult one, given the union's membership structure dependent on many companies, which will be negatively affected by the transformation. And what I am now showing on the screen is a selection of our observations regarding how IG Metall is trying to minimize the negative impact of the technological change on the domestic automotive employment. Due to time limitations, I will not discuss it in more detail, but let me highlight maybe one strategy which is an already established crisis response pattern in the German industry, established at least since the 2008 crisis, namely the attempt to minimize any layoff pressures through working time flexibility measures. And recently, IG Metall has suggested to rely exactly on this pattern to manage also the structural change in the automotive industry. More specifically, the union has proposed a sector-wide agreement shortening the working week to 4 days, and this in order to minimize layoffs in the context of the declining labor demand. But in addition to these still rather traditional measures, another and more innovative strategy of IG Metall in the context of the COVID crisis is the so-called Best Owner Group initiative. The general idea here is that IG Metall will create a capital fund to take over a number of crisis-affected but still system-relevant German suppliers. And then for a number of years, the fund will manage the downsizing processes at these companies. And in this way, it will help both to save jobs at the supplier sector and help to stabilize supply chains of OEMs who will be still producing combustion engine vehicles. The success of this initiative is still uncertain, but we find it interesting because it indicates how also German trade unions may want to redefine their roles in the context of the ongoing crisis. And second, we find this initiative interesting also as an indication of the continued relevance of close collaboration between the German state and the sectoral actors, the industry itself and the trade unions. Because as I am showing on the slide in the last line, according to the current plans, the state should be involved in the best owner group as a provider of patient capital, which will be used to guarantee investments made by private stakeholders. And with this point, I'm at the end of our presentation, which lasted a bit longer than we have planned. I want to emphasize again, as also Martin mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that these were still exploratory observations from our ongoing projects and that some interpretations may change. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will be very happy to answer your questions during the discussion round.